On October 17, 2019, Declan Marsh paddled out into the Atlantic at Nazaré, Portugal, and didn't come back. No board washed ashore, no distress signal, no body tumbling in the shore break for some horrified tourist to find, just a gray ocean swallowing a man whole, the way it had swallowed men for centuries off that particular stretch of coast. And by the following Tuesday, the Portuguese Maritime Authority had classified him as a probable drowning and moved on.
I'm Lucas, and this is Lost Files. We tell the stories that mainstream media ignores. The disappearances, the mysteries, the cases that deserve more attention. If you know a story that needs to be heard, drop it in the form linked below. And if this one stuck with you, subscribe and let me know your thoughts in the comments.
He was 31, American. A former wilderness EMT from Bend, Oregon, who'd quit his job 8 months earlier after a call he wouldn't talk about. A hiker, a fall, something that happened with his hands that he couldn't undo. He'd sold his truck, sublet his apartment, and gone traveling with a one-way ticket and a 9-foot pine-tail surfboard that he'd shaped himself in a friend's garage. He'd been in Portugal for 6 weeks, sleeping in a rented room above a bakery in the village of Pedernera, surfing the massive swells at Praia do Norte when conditions allowed, eating grilled sardines and drinking cheap wine and doing what young Americans do when they're running from something they haven't named yet. His girlfriend, Lena Sievert, a 29-year-old physical therapist from Munich, who'd met him at a hostel in Lagos 3 weeks before he disappeared, filed the missing persons report. She walked into the Guarda Nacional Republicana post in Nazaré on the evening of October 17th, her hair still damp from the rain, and told the officer at the desk that Declan had gone out that morning and hadn't returned. The officer asked if she'd checked the bars. She had. She'd checked the bars, the beach, the hospital in Leiria, the other surfers she could find. She'd called his phone 43 times. It rang. No one answered. Then it stopped ringing altogether. He wouldn't just leave, she told them. Not without his things, not without telling me. His room above the bakery was untouched. His passport was in the dresser drawer under a folded t-shirt. His wallet was there. His journal, a battered moleskin he carried everywhere, was there, half filled with surf notes and tide charts and small pencil sketches of the coastline. Everything a person needs to exist in the modern world sitting in a rented room, waiting for an owner who would not return. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days, helicopter sweeps along the cliffs, a rigid inflatable working the cove south of the Sidio headland. They found his leash, the cord that attaches a surfer's ankle to the board, tangled in rocks near the lighthouse point, severed cleanly. No board. The leash was consistent with a wipeout in heavy surf, the kind that happens at Nazaré more often than the tourism board would like to advertise. Nazaré is not a normal wave. The underwater canyon that funnels toward shore creates swells that can reach 80, 90, 100 feet on the right day. Surfers come from everywhere to ride them. Some of those surfers die. It happens with a regularity that the locals have absorbed into their understanding of the ocean the way farmers absorb drought, not as aberration, but as the cost of proximity. A young American drowning at Nazaré was not, by local standards, unusual. It was sad. It was noted. And within 3 weeks, the active investigation was suspended. Case number 1247/19. Missing person, presumed deceased. Filed. Lena Sievert stayed in Nazaré for 2 more weeks, walking the beaches at low tide looking for something she couldn't articulate. His board, his body, some evidence that the ocean had taken him rather than simply erased him. She didn't find it. She flew back to Munich in November. She kept his journal. She kept paying for his phone line for 4 months, calling it sometimes just to hear it ring into nothing, until the Portuguese carrier finally disconnected the number. Declan Marsh ceased to exist in any administrative sense. His parents in Bend were notified through the U.S. consulate in Lisbon. His mother, Colleen, flew to Portugal, met with the Coast Guard, stood on the cliff above Praia do Norte in the wind, and came home with nothing except the possessions from his room above the bakery. His father, a retired carpenter named Gavin, didn't go. He'd had a stroke the previous year that left him with limited mobility and unlimited time to think about his son being dead at the bottom of the Atlantic. There was a memorial in Bend in December. 40 people came. His former partner on the EMT crew, a woman named Darcy Phelps, spoke briefly and then sat down and didn't speak again for the rest of the service. Someone paddled a wreath out into the Deschutes River. The local paper ran a paragraph, and that was it. That was the end of Declan Marsh for 14 months. The fisherman's name was Tomas Collado. He was 67 years old, born in Nazaré, son and grandson of fishermen, a man whose relationship with the ocean was not recreational but transactional. It gave him fish, it took his friends, and he did not sentimentalize the exchange. He fished the coast south of the canyon, working the rock shelves and coves that tourists rarely visited because the access paths were steep and the currents were ugly. On December 3, 2020, at approximately 4:30 in the morning, Tomas was motoring his small boat past a stretch of cliff face called the Costelas, the Ribs, named for the way the rock formations jutted from the cliff like the exposed skeleton of something enormous. The tide was retreating. The caves that the Atlantic had carved into the base of the cliffs were beginning to reveal themselves, their mouths dark and slick, exhaling the sour breath of trapped seawater. He saw the light. Not much of one. A dim orange flicker. Deep inside the largest cave, the one the locals called Boca do Diabo, the Devil's Mouth. It was visible only because the tide was exceptionally low and the cave entrance was momentarily wide enough to see past the first bend. Tomas was not a superstitious man, despite living in a place that practically manufactured superstition. His first thought was teenagers. His second thought was smugglers. The caves along this coast had been used for contraband since the 16th century, and old habits die hard in places where the geography is accommodating. His third thought was that it was none of his business. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he went back. The tide on December 5th was even lower. A winter neap tide that pulled the ocean back farther than usual, exposing rock that spent most of the year submerged. Tomas anchored his boat 50 meters off the cliff face and took his skiff in. He had a flashlight, a gutting knife, and the casual fatalism of a man who had been doing dangerous things near water for 6 decades. The cave entrance at low tide was roughly 4 meters wide and 2 meters high, enough to bring the skiff in, though the ceiling dripped and the walls narrowed quickly. Beyond the first chamber, the cave bent to the right and opened into a larger space that Tomas had never entered, because at normal tides it was underwater. He smelled it before he saw anything. Smoke. Fish. Something organic and sour, the smell of a human being who has not been fully clean in a very long time, and underneath that, something else. The mineral smell of rock that has been lived in, warmed by a body, inhabited. His flashlight found the walls first. Scratches. Hundreds of them grouped in fives, the universal tally of counted days. Then, on a natural shelf in the rock, a row of shells arranged by size, small tools made from driftwood and stone, a pile of dried seaweed compressed into something like a mattress, a pit of ash where a fire had burned recently, and in the far corner, crouched against the rock with his hands raised against the light, a man. Tomas Collado had seen drowning victims. He'd seen bodies pulled from nets, gray and bloated and barely human. He'd seen what the ocean did to people. He had never seen what the land did. The man was skeletal. Not thin, skeletal. The architecture of his bones visible through skin that had gone the color of old leather, cracked at the joints, split across the knuckles. His beard reached his chest, matted and crusted with salt. He was wearing what had once been clothing, a t-shirt so degraded it was essentially a rag, shorts held together with strips of woven grass, and his hair. His hair was white, not gray, not sun-bleached, not the gradual fading of pigment. White. The pure, absolute white of someone whose body has decided that color is a luxury it can no longer afford. Tomas said something in Portuguese. The man flinched, not at the words, but at the sound itself, pressing himself harder against the cave wall, his eyes tracking not Tomas's face but his flashlight, his voice, the sound of water against the skiff's hull. Then the man spoke, in English, hoarse, barely above a whisper, a voice that had clearly not been used for conversation in a very long time. "What month is it?" Tomas didn't speak English, but he understood the question, or rather, he understood the species of desperation behind it. He held up his hands, palms out, the way you approach a wounded animal. He said slowly, "Decembro, December." The man closed his eyes. His lips moved silently as if calculating. "How long?" the man whispered. Then, in broken Portuguese that sounded memorized from fragments, "Quanto tempo?" Tomas understood that too. He held up one finger, then 4. 14. 14 months since the American surfer had vanished and the Coast Guard had stopped looking. The man, Declan Marsh, though Tomas didn't know that yet, opened his eyes. They were the palest blue Tomas had ever seen, paler than they should have been, as if the color had leached out of them along with everything else. They moved constantly, tracking sounds that Tomas couldn't hear, flicking toward the cave entrance at the slightest change in the rhythm of the water. "I can't leave," Declan said. "They'll know." Tomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the fear. It was total. It wasn't the fear of a man who's been lost, it was the fear of a man who's been found. The Policia Judiciaria were called within hours. 2 officers from the Leiria branch arrived at the hospital in Nazaré, where Tomas had convinced through gestures, patience, and the eventual assistance of a bilingual nurse reached by phone, Declan to go. The extraction from the cave had taken nearly an hour. Declan could walk technically, but his muscles had atrophied to the point where the uneven rock was treacherous, and he stopped every few meters, turning his head, listening to things that existed only in the frequency range his brain had learned to occupy. The admitting physician, Dr. Inés Barata, documented his condition with the clinical thoroughness of someone who understood she was looking at something she'd never see again. Severe malnutrition, chronic dehydration despite proximity to freshwater seeps in the cave system, vitamin D deficiency so profound his bones were beginning to soften, solar keratosis on every exposed surface, infected lacerations on his hands and feet, some partially healed, some fresh, layered over each other like geological strata of injury, muscle wasting consistent with prolonged caloric deficit, dental erosion from a diet heavy in shellfish and salt, and the hair. Dr. Barata noted it carefully, candidus subita, the clinical term for rapid hair whitening, rare but documented, associated with extreme psychological stress, autoimmune response, or in some cases acute trauma, not supernatural, not mysterious. The body, under sufficient duress, simply stops producing melanin. The pigment drains out of the hair shaft like color draining out of a photograph left in the sun. It was the hearing that puzzled her. Declan responded to sounds that the medical staff couldn't detect. The hum of the fluorescent lights made him wince. He could identify individual footsteps in the hallway, not just that someone was approaching, but their approximate weight, speed, and whether they were wearing hard or soft shoes. When a cart was wheeled past his room 2 floors below, he turned toward the sound before it was audible to anyone else present. Dr. Barata consulted with a neurologist in Lisbon by phone. The working theory was auditory hyperacuity, a documented phenomenon in individuals subjected to prolonged sensory deprivation or environments where survival depends on acoustic awareness. His brain hadn't gained a new ability, it had reallocated resources. 14 months in near silence in a cave where the difference between a rising tide and a retreating one was a subtle change in echo, where the sound of a boat motor meant danger, where every crack and drip had to be cataloged and assessed. His auditory cortex had expanded to fill the space left by the parts of his brain that no longer needed to process traffic noise, conversation, music, the ambient roar of human civilization. He could hear things no one else could hear because he'd spent 14 months in a world where hearing was the difference between living and dying. There was nothing miraculous about it, it was adaptation. It was the brain doing exactly what brains do when everything inessential is stripped away, and what remains is a single imperative: survive. But adaptation and miracle look the same from the outside. And from the inside, Declan Marsh was not entirely sure which one it was. He wouldn't speak to the Policia Judiciaria officers, not that first day. He lay in the hospital bed with the lights dimmed to the lowest setting the staff could manage, a blanket pulled to his chin despite the room being warm, and he watched the door. Not looked at, watched. The way a prey animal watches a gap in the brush. The officers, a junior detective named Nuno Carvalho and his partner, a woman named Beatriz Lopez, stood in the hallway and debated what to do. They had a missing person, found alive, which was good. They had a man who appeared to have been living in a cave for over a year, which was unusual. And they had a man who was clearly terrified not of the cave, not of the ocean, but of other people. "He's afraid of us," Lopes said. "He's been alone for 14 months, Carvalho said. "He's probably afraid of everything." Lopes shook her head. "No, he's afraid of us specifically, of people in uniforms, of authority. Did you see how he looked at your badge?" Carvalho had seen. Declan's eyes had locked on the badge the way they'd lock on a weapon. They called their superior. Their superior called Lisbon. Lisbon assigned the case to the Leiria branch of the Policia Judiciaria, Major Crimes Division, on the theory that a man who'd been missing for 14 months and was afraid of police probably had a reason that fell under their jurisdiction. The case was assigned to Inspector Marta Fonseca. Fonseca was 57 years old and 3 months from mandatory retirement when the file landed on her desk. She was a small woman with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, short gray hair she cut herself, and a reputation for 2 things: meticulous case files and an almost pathological refusal to hurry. She had spent 31 years with the Policia Judiciaria, the last 11 in Leiria, which was not Lisbon, which was not where careers went to distinguish themselves. She had investigated homicides, financial fraud, human trafficking networks that operated out of the industrial port towns along the coast. She was good. She was not flashy. She had never been interviewed on television and had no desire to be. She did her work the way Tomas Collado fished, methodically, patiently, without sentiment. Her colleagues sometimes called her a bibliotecaria, the librarian, because of how she organized her case files. She had an index system that predated the department's digital conversion and was, by most accounts, superior to it. When the department's servers crashed in 2016, Fonseca's cases were the only ones that didn't lose documentation. She kept paper copies of everything. She trusted paper the way other detectives trusted informants, more than she probably should have, but it had never let her down. When she read the initial report on Declan Marsh, American surfer, missing 14 months, found in a cave, hair white, afraid of police, she did what she always did. She went to the beginning. She pulled the original missing persons file, case 1247/19. She read it in her office with the door closed, her glasses on, a cup of coffee going cold beside her. It took her 11 minutes to read the file. It should have taken longer. That was the problem. The file was thin. Not thin as in the evidence was limited. Thin as in no one tried. The Coast Guard search had been competent but narrow. 3 days, focused on the water, treating it as a drowning. The GNR had taken Lena Sievert's statement and done exactly nothing with it. No interviews with other surfers who'd been in the water that day, no canvass of the harbor, no review of maritime traffic in the area, no contact with the U.S. consulate beyond the standard notification. A man had disappeared, and the system had processed him efficiently, routinely, and completely without curiosity. Fonseca set the file down. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Ninguém fez perguntas," she said to herself. Nobody asked questions. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Barata at the hospital. "The American," she said. "When can I speak with him?" "He hasn't spoken to anyone," Dr. Barata said. "He asked for water. He asked what month it was. He asked if anyone was looking for him. Beyond that, nothing." "Who told him no one was looking?" No one told him that. Then why did he ask? There was a pause. I don't know, Dr. Barada said, but he asked it like he already knew the answer. Fonseca drove to the hospital that evening. She did not bring her badge. She did not bring a recorder. She brought a paper bag containing 2 pastéis de nata from the bakery in Pedernera, the same bakery, though she didn't know it yet, where Declan Marsh had rented a room 14 months ago, where his landlady still kept his surfboard in the storage closet because no one had claimed it, and she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. She knocked on his door. She waited. She didn't open it. After a long time, a voice said, "Come in," hoarse, barely there. She entered. She sat in the chair beside his bed. She set the pastry bag on the table. She didn't introduce herself as police. She didn't introduce herself at all. "I brought these," she said in English that was careful and accented and perfectly grammatical. "From the bakery in the village. I thought you might remember them." Declan Marsh looked at the bag. Then he looked at her. Really looked. His pale eyes moving across her face the way they'd move across the surface of the water, reading it. She let him look. She didn't fill the silence. 3 minutes passed. The fluorescent light hummed. Down the hall, a cart rattled. Declan's head turned toward the sound, tracked it, dismissed it. His eyes came back to Fonseca. "You're police," he said. "Yes." "You didn't bring your badge." "No." "Why?" "Because you're afraid of badges, and I'm not here to frighten you. I'm here because nobody asked you what happened, and I think it's time someone did." Another silence. Longer this time. Declan reached for the pastry bag. He opened it with hands that shook, not from weakness, Fonseca noted, but from the fine motor difficulty of someone whose hands had spent a year gripping rock and shell and driftwood. Nothing delicate. Nothing that required precision. He ate one of the pastries in 4 bites, then the other. Then he folded the paper bag into a precise square, a habit, Fonseca thought, of a man who had learned to waste nothing. He looked at her again. "They'll know I'm out," he said. "If you're here, if there's a report, they'll know." "Who will know?" He shook his head. Not refusal. Something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying information too heavy for one person, for too long, in too much silence. "I wrote it down," he said. "In the cave. I wrote everything down, in case I died and someone found it." "Wrote it where?" "In a notebook. I took it from my room before—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "It's still in the cave, behind a rock, near the back wall, wrapped in plastic." Fonseca didn't reach for her phone. She didn't signal urgency. She sat perfectly still, the way she'd learned to sit in 31 years of interviews, the way that tells the other person they have all the time in the world. "You don't have to tell me anything tonight," she said, "but I need you to understand something. I read your case file today, the one from when you disappeared." He waited. "It's 11 pages long," she said. "For a man who vanished from the face of the earth for 14 months, 11 pages is not enough. It means nobody tried. And I need you to understand that I am not nobody, and I am going to try." Something moved behind Declan Marsh's eyes. Not trust. Not yet. But the possibility of trust. The memory of what it felt like to believe that another person might act on your behalf. "The notebook," he said again. "Get the notebook first, then I'll talk." Fonseca nodded. She stood. She did not extend her hand. She'd noticed that he flinched at unexpected movement. "I'll go at low tide," she said, "tomorrow morning." "Be careful," Declan said. And then quieter, in a voice that had spent 14 months talking only to rock and water, "There are things in that notebook that people have already killed to keep quiet." Fonseca paused at the door. "Then it's a good thing," she said, "that I'm 3 months from retirement and have nothing left to lose." She left. The hallway was bright and loud and full of the sounds of a functioning hospital. Behind her, in the dimmed room, Declan Marsh sat motionless, listening to her footsteps recede. counting them, cataloging them, the way he'd cataloged every sound for 14 months. 13 steps to the elevator, a slight drag on the left foot, rubber soles on linoleum. She walked the way she talked, steadily, without hurry, as if the world could wait. He listened until he couldn't hear her anymore. Then he listened to the silence she left behind. It was the first silence in 14 months that didn't feel like danger. Fonseca went to the cave at 5:15 the next morning. She brought Tomas Calado as a guide because the old fisherman knew the tides the way she knew case law, not as abstract knowledge, but as something felt in the body, a rhythm you either respected or paid for. He didn't ask why she needed to go back. He understood that whatever he'd found in that cave was the beginning of something, not the end, and that his role was to deliver her safely and keep his mouth shut. He was good at both. The tide was lower than it had been on the 5th. The cave opened like a wound in the cliff face, dark and exhaling cold air that smelled of salt and smoke and the particular mineral dampness of stone that has been breathing seawater for millennia. Fonseca climbed from the skiff onto the rock shelf at the cave's mouth, her flashlight cutting a white line through the dark, and felt something she had not felt in 31 years of police work. Awe. Not at the crime. She didn't know the crime yet. At the survival. At the evidence of a human being refusing to die in a place where dying would have been the easier choice. The cave was exactly as Tomas had described, but seeing it for herself was different. The tally marks on the walls. She counted clusters as she moved deeper, stopped counting at 200. The shell arrangements on the rock shelf, organized not randomly but by species, then by size within species, the system of a mind that needed order the way a body needs food. The ash pit, the seaweed bed, the driftwood tools sharpened against stone, until they held something like an edge. And in the back, behind a flat rock that had been deliberately positioned to look natural, wrapped in a plastic bag that had once held bread from the Pedernera bakery, a notebook. Not the moleskin from his room, a different one. Fonseca recognized it as the type sold at the small stationery shop near the Nazaré harbor. Cheap cardboard cover, lined pages, the kind students use. He must have bought it before he disappeared. Before whatever happened that sent him into the cliffs instead of back to his rented room. She didn't open it in the cave. She put it inside her jacket, against her chest, and climbed back into the skiff. She read it in her car, parked at the harbor, with the engine off and the windows fogging. It took her 2 hours. She read it twice. Then she sat for a long time, watching the fishing boats come in, and thought about what she was going to do. The notebook contained 97 pages of writing. Some entries were dated, some weren't. The handwriting deteriorated as the pages progressed, starting precise and small, the penmanship of someone accustomed to writing field reports and ending in a cramped, shaking scrawl that was barely legible. Some pages were water damaged. Some had been written over, text layered on text as he ran out of clean pages. What follows is what Fonseca was eventually able to reconstruct, corroborated over the following months by physical evidence, financial records, maritime logs, and the testimony of 4 witnesses who had kept quiet for over a year because they were afraid of exactly the people Declan Marsh was afraid of. On the morning of October 17, 2019, Declan had paddled out at Praia do Norte at dawn. The swell was large but not historic, 15 to 20 foot faces, manageable for an experienced surfer. He'd been in the water for roughly 2 hours when he noticed a rigid inflatable boat anchored in the channel south of the main break, near the base of the cliffs. Not unusual in itself. Boats work that area regularly, tow-in crews for the big wave surfers, fishing vessels, the occasional tourist charter, but this boat wasn't fishing, and it wasn't towing surfers. Declan was sitting outside the break waiting for a set when the current carried him south, closer to the cliffs than he'd intended, close enough to see what was being offloaded from the inflatable into the cave mouths at the base of the rock. Wrapped bales, heavy from the way the men handled them. passed from the boat to a rock ledge to hands that reached out from inside the darkness. He wrote, "I should have paddled away. I knew what it was. Everyone who spent time on any coast knows what that looks like. But the current had me, and by the time I corrected, they'd seen me." A man on the inflatable looked directly at him. Not with surprise, with assessment. The calculating gaze of someone determining whether a problem could be ignored or needed to be solved. Declan paddled hard for the main beach. He caught a wave in, a bad one, angled wrong, and the wipeout drove him into the impact zone. When he surfaced, his leash had snapped, or been cut. He never knew which. The board was gone. He swam for shore, swallowing water, exhausted, and dragged himself onto the rocks at the base of the Cedio headland, a quarter-mile south of where he'd intended to land. He rested on the rocks for 20 minutes, coughing, shaking. Then he climbed the cliff path toward the village. The rigid inflatable was already at the harbor. He recognized the man who'd looked at him. The man was standing on the quay, talking to another man, relaxed, smoking. The conversation looked ordinary. The men looked ordinary. When the one from the boat glanced up and saw Declan walking along the harbor road, wet, boardless, clearly the surfer who'd been in the water, he didn't react visibly. He just watched. The way the man in the parking lot watches, the way the predator calibrates. Declan went back to his room. He told himself he'd imagined it. He told himself it was nothing. He packed his bag anyway, passport, wallet, phone, journal, and was reaching for the door when he heard footsteps on the stairs. 2 sets, heavy, unhurried. He went out the window. It was a second-floor window overlooking the bakery's back courtyard. He dropped onto a storage shed roof, then to the ground, carrying nothing but the clothes he was wearing and the notebook he'd bought 2 days earlier and shoved into his waistband on an impulse he couldn't explain. Everything else, passport, wallet, phone, the moleskin with his drawings, stayed in the room. He ran. He didn't go to the police. The notebook explains why, though the explanation reads like the reasoning of someone operating under extreme stress, making decisions that feel logical in the moment and irrational in retrospect. He'd seen what he'd seen. He didn't know who the men were, but he knew the scale of what they were moving. The bales, the infrastructure, the caves, the comfort with which they operated suggested something entrenched, something with protection. He was a foreigner. He had no phone. He had no identification. He'd been in the country 6 weeks and spoke enough Portuguese to order food and ask for directions, nothing more. And he'd been an EMT long enough to understand triage. The immediate threat was not the police's absence. It was the men's presence. They knew where he lived. They'd come to his room. The window was a matter of minutes. He went to the only place he could think of where people wouldn't follow. The cliffs, the caves, the places where the ocean made the rules and only someone who understood water would survive. He'd explored the coastline on foot during his weeks in Nazaré. He knew about the caves south of the canyon, had even kayaked past them once, noting how the larger ones extended deep into the cliff, how fresh water seeped through cracks in the rock, how the tidal pools held mussels and crabs and small fish. He'd thought at the time that a person could survive there if they had to. He found out he was right. The first weeks were the worst. He wrote about cold so profound it felt like a second skin, about hunger that moved from his stomach to his bones, to his teeth, about the terror of high tides that flooded the cave to within a foot of the ceiling, forcing him to cling to a rock shelf in the dark with water surging around his chest, not knowing if this was the tide that wouldn't retreat. About cutting his hands on barnacles so many times that the cuts stopped healing and simply became part of him. Permanent openings in his skin that wept and crusted and wept again. He learned. The way humans have always learned, by necessity, by error, by the slow accumulation of knowledge paid for in suffering. He learned which tides were safe and which required retreat to the upper chamber. He learned to trap small fish in rock pools, to harvest mussels and limpets, to find the freshwater seep that ran fastest after rain. He learned to make fire with driftwood and friction, a skill he'd practiced as a wilderness EMT and never expected to use for survival. He learned to listen. The cave taught him sound. Every echo carried information, the depth of water, the direction of current, the approach of boats. A motor at 200 meters sounds different from a motor at 50. A fishing boat sounds different from an inflatable. The rhythm of the tide creates a baseline, and any deviation from that baseline means something is wrong. His world narrowed to acoustics. The visual field in the cave was limited. Darkness, rock, the variable light at the entrance. But the auditory field was vast, a cathedral of echoes that extended far beyond what he could see. His brain did what brains do. It compensated. It specialized. It turned him into a listening instrument calibrated to the specific frequencies of his environment. When Tomas found him, Declan could distinguish the species of bird passing over the cave mouth by the sound of its wing beat alone. He could not remember the sound of his mother's voice. Fonseca retrieved the notebook and spent 3 weeks doing what nobody had done in 2019. She asked questions. She pulled maritime records for the Nazaré harbor from October 2019. She cross-referenced registered vessels with known narcotics investigations. She contacted the Policia Judiciaria's organized crime unit in Lisbon and learned that the caves south of the Nazaré Canyon had been flagged in a 2017 intelligence report as a potential transshipment point for cocaine arriving from West Africa via the Azores. The report had been filed. No action had been taken. Resources were limited. Priorities lay elsewhere. She interviewed Declan 3 more times over the following weeks. Each session was longer than the last. Each time, she brought pasté de nata. Each time, she left her badge in the car. He spoke haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency, though he never raised his voice above a conversational murmur. Volume, for him, had become something to control, to minimize. Sound was survival. Silence was safety. The investigation took 5 months. Fonseca was supposed to retire in March 2021. She didn't. She requested an extension, citing an active case, and her captain, who had read the notebook and understood what it meant, granted it. In June 2021, a coordinated operation involving the Policia Judiciaria, the Portuguese Maritime Police, and Europol raided 3 properties in the Nazaré area and intercepted a shipment of 400 kilograms of cocaine at the Costelas Cave complex. 7 men were arrested. Among them was the man Declan had seen on the inflatable, a 44-year-old Portuguese national named Rui Esteves Magalhães, who had operated a legitimate boat charter business in Nazaré for 12 years and used it as cover for a transshipment network that had been moving product through the cave since 2015. The 2 men who had climbed the stairs to Declan's room were identified as associates of Magalhães. They had intended to warn him or silence him. The distinction, in the end, didn't matter. Magalhães was convicted in February 2022 and sentenced to 23 years. During the trial, he was asked about the American surfer who had seen too much. "I assumed he drowned," Magalhães said, with a shrug that the court reporter noted in the transcript but could not convey the full weight of. He hadn't drowned. He'd been 300 meters away, inside the rock, living on mussels and rainwater and silence, counting days and scratches on the wall. Nah. Declan Marsh returned to the United States in the autumn of 2021. He flew from Lisbon to Portland, and his mother drove down from Bend to meet him at the airport. She saw him before he saw her, a man she barely recognized, thin and weathered and white-haired at 33, moving through the terminal with a strange, careful watchfulness, his head turning toward sounds she couldn't hear. She said his name. He stopped. He turned. He didn't cry. Neither did she. They stood in the arrivals hall with people streaming around them, and she put her hands on his face the way she had when he was a child, and he let her. "You're so quiet," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." He went back to Bend. He didn't go back to the EMT service. He couldn't. The hyperacuity that had kept him alive in the cave made the sirens unbearable, the radio chatter overwhelming. Sounds that a normal brain filtered into background noise hit him unmediated, raw, a constant flood of auditory information his nervous system couldn't learn to ignore. He works part-time now at a kayak outfitter on the Deschutes River. He paddles, but he doesn't surf. He sees a therapist who specializes in prolonged isolation trauma. His hair is still white. Lena Sievert flew from Munich when she heard. They met in a cafe in Nazaré 2 years and a lifetime after they'd last seen each other. She said later that he was the same person and a completely different one. The same gentleness, the same quiet humor, but underneath it a stillness that hadn't been there before. The stillness of someone who has learned that silence is the natural state of the world and noise is the interruption. They are not together. They write to each other sometimes. Tomás Calado still fishes the costelas. He passes the cave at low tide and doesn't look inside. He told his wife that he found a man living in a hole in the cliff, and she crossed herself and told him to stay away from such places. "It's just a cave," Tomás said. "Nothing is just a cave," she said, "not on that coast." Inspector Marta Fonseca retired in September 2021, 4 months late. Her final case file on the Marsh investigation was 347 pages long, indexed by her personal system, with paper copies of every document. When the department's servers were migrated to a new platform the following year, and 3 weeks of digital records were corrupted, Fonseca's files survived. They always did. On a shelf in the evidence archive in Leiria, sealed in plastic, there is a cheap notebook with a cardboard cover, 97 pages of a man's handwriting, deteriorating from precise to desperate to something beyond both. The record of a mind trying to hold itself together against silence and stone and the endless patience of the Atlantic. The last legible entry, dated approximately 13 months into his disappearance, reads, "I can hear the barnacles growing on the rock at low tide. I can hear the water moving through channels inside the cliff that no one has ever seen. I can hear my own blood in my ears and the ocean outside, and I am losing the ability to tell which is which. I am becoming the cave, or the cave is becoming me. I don't know anymore. I don't know if it matters. If someone finds this and I am dead, my name is Declan Marsh. I am from Bend, Oregon. I was not lost. I was hiding." There is a difference, and the difference is that lost people want to be found. I did too, I just couldn't risk it. Tell my mother I didn't drown. Tell Lena I'm sorry about the phone. Tell whoever reads this that the ocean is not the thing to be afraid of. It's not the waves, or the cold, or the dark. It's the quiet. The quiet is the thing that changes you. It gets inside your ears, and then inside your head, and then inside the place where you keep the sound of your own name, and it replaces it with something else, something older, something that was here before people, before language, before anyone needed a name at all. I can still hear it. I will always hear it. I just hope someday I can hear something else too.